Every textbook on labor unions begins with the quote from Samuel Gompers, who was a very old labor organizer back in the 1800s, who said that unions want more, more, more. Now, as an economist, we do remember this idea when modeling union behavior, no matter how corny it is when it gets incorporated into these chapters. Now, a lot of people say that companies are greedy, so we need to think of labor unions in the same way. In reality, it's not so much that they're greedy, that they're evil, or anything like that. It's that they're trying to maximize their own personal benefit to achieve the highest possible level of utility at their lowest cost. So, like the firm, the union is comprised of a number of individuals who are all acting in their own self-interest with their own desires and goals. But the way that we're going to talk about this analysis through this chapter, because we're keeping it at a fairly high level, we're going to stay simple. We're going to talk about unions having a singular goal, kind of acting like they're one individual or one unit, like we have been talking about with firms. So we can think of them quite a bit like firms. They're acting in their own self-interest. That's what they're trying to maximize. And that even though they're made of people, we're thinking of them and talking about them as if they're acting in with one singular goal in mind. Now, there are a few different models of union behavior that we're going to talk about. The first thing that we're going to talk about here is the monopoly union. So all the workers are belonging to this union. They're only able to hire union workers like within those firms where they're being done. So it basically work with the union, hire the workers or not. So we're going to see how their negotiation tactics work. Basically, what we have here is a labor union kind of setting the workers' wages through their negotiations with the firm. But basically, we're going to look at them as if they're demanding to get a specific wage, and that's what firms are going to agree with. So, based on that wage, the firm decides how many workers they want to employ. They're kind of taking that as a given. Before, firms would take wages as given by the market. So the overall labor market would determine what wages would be through the interaction of supply and demand. So all the different firms and all the workers. Firms didn't have enough market power through most of the models that we looked at to actually like determine wages. They just kind of had to take what was in the market. Now they're doing the same thing, but it's based on what the unions are willing to negotiate. And importantly, because firms face a hard budget constraint, you literally cannot keep losing money forever. When firms' labor costs increase, at some point they need to hire fewer workers. They need to reduce those labor costs to get it back down to a manageable level so that they can operate at a profit or minimize their losses in the short term. So as a result, if unions raise wages above the equilibrium level, what we'll see is kind of a side effect of lower employment for unionized workers in that firm or in that industry. Now, based on some of our exercises over the past few weeks, some of the problem sets and examples that we went through in the lectures and in the textbook, this should make sense that increasing the cost of wages is going to end up on the margin, decreasing the level of employment. There are some workers out there who would have been happy to work at that equilibrium wage, which is lower than the union wage, that are going to end up not being hired at this higher union wage. So those workers specifically are going to lose out. But all of the workers who are hired and are working at the higher union wage will benefit. There's typically more of them than there are the workers that will lose their jobs. Now, how many workers lose out on employment differs by firm and it differs by industry. So as an example, if the firm's labor demand is relatively inelastic, meaning that the firm's labor demand is not responsive to a change in wages, then unions are going to be more effective. There will be fewer job losses because the firm will be willing to absorb the extra labor costs. So on the midterm, there was that question about the high-tech firm. Their labor demand was relatively inelastic because of the lack of substitutes in their production process. Those firms needed the workers. So in this case, they'd be willing to absorb the higher labor costs and they wouldn't fire that many workers. They would maintain higher levels of employment pretty close to where they were before the wage increase. On the other hand, fast food restaurants were the other example, kind of at the other end, or the other extreme. They would be much more sensitive to changes in wages. So if there was a union bargaining for higher wages for fast food restaurant workers, it would result in comparatively larger job losses and a greater shift of capital in the production process. So now let's explore this graphically. I know I can hear some of your groans through time and space. I use Microsoft Paint to turn the figure from 10.3 in the text with multiple demand curves and utility curves into a simple one here so we can start with a simple explanation without all these extra curves in the way. Hopefully this helps you guys. So let's set up the players. You have the union on one side that wants to maximize their utility for their workers. In this case, let's just think of it being employment and wages, just a combination of that. Of course, they care about more, but we can't show this stuff graphically if we start getting into 3, 4, 5, 6 characteristics. On the other hand, we have the firm. The firm wants to maximize their profits. So to do that, they want to try to minimize their labor costs. Now, these two parties are opposed, kind of like in the regular market, how we have consumers that want to buy at a low price and firms that want to sell at a high price. And through their interactions, the firm and consumers end up, guiding the market towards an equilibrium price that's somewhere in the middle between both of their goals. The same sort of thing happens here with unions and with firms. Through their interactions, the firm and the union will reach a new equilibrium wage level and employment level. In this example, firms face a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, this means that as wages that firms have to pay workers increase, fewer workers are going to be hired by firms in this case because of the added cost of each worker. Now, the union has indifference curves similar to what we saw with all workers. So this is their difference curve right here, very similar to what we saw with workers, the same kind of shape. It has the same sorts of properties. All indifference curves or utility functions have those properties. And also, firms are constrained by the union demands, and unions are constrained by what's possible for the firm while staying in business. Now, so that's why we have the interaction between the two being so important in this toy model that we're working with here. So let's suppose that in a fully free market, the equilibrium wage would be W star right here, and the employment level will be E star. So that's corresponding to this point on the demand curve. But in this case, union workers and the rank and file, they want higher wages for the workers. So to determine where that will be, we look to see where their utility curve is tangent to the demand curve. So in this case, it's here at point M, where the utility curve, the indifference curve right here, just barely touches the demand curve at one point. So we end up with higher wages and lower levels of employment. Now, why do we choose the tangent point on this utility curve? Now, if we chose this point up here that I drew on hastily, we would end up with higher wages for these workers, but there would be a greater reduction in employment. Instead of EM here, it would be down here, closer to the origin. That produces a lower level of utility. The reason being is that it lies on the utility curve that's, U prime or U tick here, that's closer to the origin. So think of it as this utility curve is, say, 100 units of utility. This U prime here is only 75 units. It's less. So the firm or the union is going to want to push out to their farthest possible utility curve that touches the demand curve, which is going to be this one right here. So this point M, based on these utility curves and the demand curve, this point is the best that the union can do, given the firm they're dealing with and how the firm would respond to changes in wages and all that fun stuff. So going back to the simple model, at point M right here, the wage is higher than the initial equilibrium. It's moved up from W star up to WM. But the level of employment is now lower. It's at EM down here, which is lower than the equilibrium employment level, E star. So this highlights an important lesson. So higher wages end up leading to lower employment in these situations. So when unions are able to achieve higher wages for their workers through the negotiation or threats of strike or whatever forms they go through to get it, it's going to have this negative side effect of decreasing employment. Now, how much lower employment is determined by how sensitive firms are to changes in wages. So we're going to think about elasticity, something we learned about somewhat before. The change in wage from equilibrium to the union's demands do not change the firm's demand curve. So the firm still has this demand curve D right here. But what we do is we move along it. Initially, the market wage was set here, so imagine another supply and demand curve with the upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping market demand curve. Where they intersected would be W star here. That's why it's seemingly in a weird place because it's being determined elsewhere. And then the union is negotiating a higher wage, so moving up to this point M. So it's not any change in the overall market that's causing this to occur. So we're not seeing a shift in the demand curve, We're seeing a movement along the demand curve because, something, in this case, the union negotiating is bringing us out of equilibrium, that initial equilibrium that the market was in. Now, this adds on another demand curve. Let me get that out of the way from the slide. Here we go. So this demand curve, D prime right here, is a lot steeper. This shows what happens if labor demand is less elastic or less sensitive to a change in wages. So this D prime adds a demand curve for the firm that's less sensitive to a change in wages to compare to the original firm with D, that demand curve. Because the demand curve is steeper, we can see that firms are going to respond to large wage increases with small reductions in employment. So we're going to move, and this is in your text block, added here for some clarity. The initial equilibrium wage was here at E star. It's only moving down here to this employment for the market wage through 2 in there to make it different from the EM. But basically, the employment level is not quite as low as what it was for the firm that's relatively more sensitive to a change in wages. But what do we see here? The point where this new utility curve is tangent to the firm's demand curve. Remember, they're going to pick the tangent curve because that is the highest possible level of utility that the union is able to achieve. This wage is much higher than the wage would have been when the firm was sensitive to a change in labor costs. So if you think of it intuitively, like you can pretend you're watching the negotiations back and forth on Pawn Stars. Unions can get themselves large pay raises because the firms need the workers. When they need the workers, they have to bear the cost. There aren't substitutes that they can use, whether it's ununionized workers or whether it's shifting more to capital. If firms want to keep the same level of output or a similar level of output, they have to keep most of their workforce in place. So they're less sensitive to a change in wages. This increase in wages isn't going to have the same strong effects that we saw with the firm that was relatively more sensitive to a change in wages. This utility function out here is at a higher level than the original union's utility function. Say it's at 200 utils instead of 100 utils. So it's better for the union to be out here. Like I said, wages increase substantially and employment falls less in the union negotiating with the other firms. So if you're a union, what do you want the firm and the industry to look like? You want to be negotiating against the second firm, the firm whose labor demand is inelastic or they're not sensitive to a change in wages. So these firms are going to be willing to meet your demands and offer much higher wages with smaller reductions in employment. This is a big win for you. If the firms are more sensitive to a change in wages and can't bear the large increases in labor costs, like that first firm with this demand curve down here, if you were able to get some wage increases, you run the risk of larger layoffs. So if you're a union, it helps to know what kind of firm you're dealing with. You'd much rather be negotiating with, and you can push your negotiations and your demands farther if you're dealing with the second firm than you are with the first firm that we walked through. If you're an HR rep for a firm, it helps to know whether you're able to meet the demands of unions without large layoffs or not. It really helps you through that negotiation process and knowing what sort of wages you're able to offer or what sort of employment guarantees that you can keep. Now, something unions try to do, and your textbook kind of touches on this, is try to reduce the ability of firms to substitute labor for either ununionized labor or for capital. This way, if they're kind of locked in, they don't have substitutes for labor. It reduces the firm's wage elasticity, so they're able to secure gains with lower job losses. So you can imagine a firm that's able to get either, whether it's like legal from the government or from the firm's own like agreement through the negotiation process, to not use ununionized labor or to not use capital in the production process. So they can turn this demand curve here from that firm through those requirements into a demand curve more like the second one, because they're now no longer able to substitute or less able to substitute those workers. If you remember the longshoremen strike from just a little bit ago, they had to fight, or they have been fighting hard against automation in ports. That was a way to ensure that the ports need people and that firms, or the ports that are hiring them, have the demand curve that's more like this, that's less sensitive to changes in wages. That way they're able to secure these higher wage increases without sacrificing employment.